Welcome to the Pen World Voices International Festival and to the Literary Mews and, of course, mostly to our wonderful panel tonight, Tales of Two Germanys, a conversation between Maxim Leo, Yasha Monk, Atina, Grossmann, and moderated by Megan Ratner. We are very thrilled to have them here, and we're thrilled that Maxim and Yasha wrote these wonderful memoirs about growing up in Germany. Let me show you their books in case you haven't seen them, bought them, or read them. Here is Red Love, which looks very red, but you should still get it. And in yellow, almost complimentary, Stranger in My Own Country. Megan Ratner, an independent critic based in New York, writes for Film Quarterly and Film Comment, among other publications. Her essays were included in Memory, Whitechapel Gallery Documents in Contemporary Art Series, and in John Sayles' Interviews, edited by Diane Carson. She co-programmed a series on Italian post-war cinema at the American Academy in Rome and served on the jury of the inaugural Dialogue of Cultures International Film Festival. Many of her recent articles focus on films from the former Eastern Bloc. And now please join me in welcoming our wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming today. And my thanks to the organizers of the Literary Mews and Pen World Voices Festival. And special thanks to Juliane Kampfeld and to Sarah Gerner and the staff of Deutsches Haus. Each of the writers will now give a short reading, and then we will have a panel discussion and devote the last 15 minutes or so to questions from the audience. My remarks will be very short, in fact, non-existent. So I'm just going to go right into introducing Maxim Leo. Maxim Leo grew up in East Berlin. From 1990 to 1995, he studied political science at the Freie Universität Berlin and at the Paris Institut d'études politiques. From 1995 to 1996, he worked as a news reporter at RTL. As of 1997, he has reported for the Berliner Zeitung. In 2002, Maxim Leo was awarded the German-French Journalism Prize and shortlisted for the Egon Erwin Kisch Literary Prize. In 2006, he won the Theodor Wolff Journalism Prize. His autobiographical book, Haltet euer Herz bereit, eine ostdeutsche Familiengeschichte, for which he was awarded the 2011 European Book Prize, was published in Germany in 2009. Pushkin Press published the English translation titled Red Love, The Story of an East German Family in 2013. Please welcome Maxim Leo.
Thank you very much. For me, it's a premiere now because for the first time, I will read in English in public. And in my hotel today, I just asked for the front desk woman to be the first person who can listen to me and just give me some advice for the pronunciation. And she came from Puerto Rico, and she gave me very good advice. So if I have some Puerto Rico accent now, it's due to her. And I don't know what the East German and Puerto Rico fusion will give it. But so, I just read the beginning, the prologue of this book, and I stopped the time. It's 8 minutes precisely. So enjoy. When I stepped into the hospital room, Gerhard laughed. He said something. Wired, throaty words came out of his mouth. Then he laughed again. I can't remember my grandfather ever being so pleased to see me. The doctor told me the stroke had damaged the language center in Gerhard's brain. All he could do now was express emotions. The rational side of him was blocked. I reflected that it had been precisely the other way around before. Gerhard talked away at me. I pretended I understood. Eventually, I told him that, unfortunately, I didn't understand anything at all. Gerhard nodded sadly. Perhaps he had hoped I might be able to free him from his speechlessness, just as I did just as I'd sometimes helped him out of his emotional swiftness in the past, with a joke or a cheeky remark that shook his authority. I was a clown in the family, the one nobody suspected of evil intentions. I could overstep the mark with the hero of the family, the man no one else dared to contradict. A clear spring light shone through the window of the hospital room. Gerhard's face was slack and empty. We said nothing. I would have liked to have a conversation with him, I mean, a real conversation. Usually, conversations with Gerhard turned into monologues about his latest success after 10 minutes at the most. He talked about books he happened to be writing, about lectures he had given, about newspaper articles people had written about him. A few times I tried to learn more about him, more than the stories everybody knew. But he didn't want to. Perhaps he was scared of getting too close to himself, that he had got too used to being a monument. It was too late now. The man for whom language had always been the most important thing has become speechless. I can't ask him questions anymore. No one can. He's going to keep his secrets. Gerhard was a hero even before he entered adulthood. At the age of 17, he had fought with the French resistance, was tortured by the SS and freed by partisans. After the war, he came back into Germany as a victor and built up the GDR, the state in which everything was to be better. He became an important journalist, a part of the new power. They needed people like him at the time, people who had done everything right in the war, people you could refer to if you wanted to explain why this anti-fascist state had to exist. They sent him to schools and universities again and again. He talked about his fight against Hitler, about torture, about victory. I grew up with those stories. I was proud to belong to this family, to his grandfather. I knew Gerhard had had a pistol at some point, and he knew how to use explosives. When I visited my grandparents in Friedrichshagen, there were apple cake and fruit salad. Again and again, I asked Gerhard to talk about the past. Gerhard talked about frightening Nazis and courageous partisans. Sometimes he jumped up and acted out the play with different parts. When Gerhard played a Nazi, he pulled his face into a grimace and spoke in a deep, gurgling voice. After the performance, he would usually give me a bar of Milka chocolate. Even today, I think of those monster Nazis every time I eat Milka chocolate. In the presence of adults, Gerhard wasn't so funny. He didn't, like anyone in the family, to go around politicking, as he put it. In fact, everybody who didn't, like Gerhard, believe in the GDR was politicking around the place in one way or another. The worst was Wolf, my father, who wasn't even a member of the party but had married Gerhard's favorite daughter, Anne, my mother. There were lots of arguments, mostly about things I only really understood later on, about the state, about society, about the cause, whatever it happened to be. Our family was like a miniature GDR. It was here that the struggles took place, that ones that couldn't be fought out anywhere else. I repeat this sentence. It was here that the struggles took place, that the ones that couldn't be fought out anywhere else. The frontist woman never explained me how to pronounce it. Here, ideology collided with life. That struggle raged for whole years. It was the reason my father went around the house shouting, while my mother secretly cried in the kitchen, while Gerhard became a stranger to me. Gerhard and I sat together for a while on that spring day in that hospital room, which smelled of canteen food and disinfectant. It was slowly getting dark outside. Gerhard had caved in on himself. His body was there, but he seemed to be somewhere else. It may sound strange, but I had the feeling that the GDR only really came to an end at that moment. 18 years after the fall of the wall, the stern hero had disappeared. Before me there sat a helpless, lovable man, a grandfather. When I left, we hugged, which I don't think we'd ever done before. I walked down the long hospital corridor and felt at once sad and elated. That day I wished for the first time that I could go back to the GDR to understand what had actually happened there, to my grandfather, to my parents, to me. What had torn us apart? What was so important that I had turned us into strangers, even today? The GDR has been dead for ages, but it's still quite alive in my family, like a ghost that can never find peace. Eventually, when it was all over, nothing more was said about those old struggles. Perhaps we hoped things would sort themselves out, that the new age would heal the old wounds. But it wouldn't leave me be. I went to archives, I rummaged in cupboards and boxes, I found old photographs and letters, a long-forgotten diary, secret files. I asked my family questions, one after the other, for days, weeks. I asked questions that I normally never have dared go near. I was allowed to do that because I was a genealogist now. And all of a sudden, our little GDR was there again. As if I had been waiting to emerge again, to show off from every angle. Correct a few things and perhaps lose some of the rage and grief that were still there. On that journey into the past, I became, she told me twice, I became reacquainted. Okay, yeah. Okay. But it's the accent from the south, isn't it? No, nein, überhaupt nicht. Okay. Flat American. GDR. GDR. You know, the East German school system didn't teach me that. That's okay. I will just on that journey into the past, I became reacquainted with Gerhard. Anne and Wolf. And I discovered Werner, my other grandfather, whom I barely known until then. I think something was set in motion after the day with Gerhard in the hospital. A speechless man made us speak. Thank you.
We're on a very tight schedule here, so we have to move right along. The next reader will be Yasha Monk. Yasha Monk is a PhD candidate in political thought at Harvard University and the founding editor of The Utopian. He is a frequent contributor to Die Zeit, Slate, The Nation, Foreign Affairs, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal. Farrar Straus and Giroux published his first book, Stranger in My Own Country, A Jewish Family in Modern Germany, this January. Please welcome Yasha Monk.
Thank you. I would like to book you for a pronunciation lesson after this event, please, if I may. But until then, I was born in 1982 as the citizen of a democratic, forward-looking, peaceful West Germany. I've lived all over the country, growing up in reasonably idyllic places like Munich, Freiburg, Kassel, Maulbronn, Laupheim, and Karlsruhe, until I left to go to college in England at age 18. German is and will forever remain the only language I speak without an accent. My family's Jewish identity, meanwhile, has never been particularly strong. While the fact that they are Jews shaped the lives of my grandparents and even those of my parents in deeply tragic ways, they are neither religious nor traditional. As for me, I never celebrated my bar mitzvah and feel far more comfortable on a soccer field or at the library than in a synagogue. Even so, as I grew up, I came to feel more and more Jewish and less German. In July 1990, when I had just turned 8, Germany faced Argentina in the final of a World Cup. After 84 long minutes, Roberto Sensini brought down Rudi Völler. The referee awarded a penalty kick, and Andreas Brehme scored the only goal of the match. Germany took the World Championship, and I was ecstatic, waving a little German flag and chanting Deutschland, Deutschland at the television. But by 2010, when Germany faced Spain in the semifinals of the same tournament, I felt more ambivalent. Yes, Germany as team was younger, more skilled, even more diverse than ever before. Yet when the chips were down, I found myself rooting for the Spanish team. And the real reason why I was glad, or perhaps relieved, when in the 73rd minute of play, Carles Puyol headed the ball into the net for Spain's winning goal, wasn't even that I liked the Spanish team. The real reason, I feel embarrassed to admit this, but it's true, was that I simply couldn't quite bring myself to support the German team. At some point in those 2 decades, somewhere between 1990 and 2010, between the ages of 8 and 28, I had stopped rooting for the German team or identifying with Germany or thinking of myself as German. Until today, I'm not quite sure why this happened. And so my book is an attempt to try to understand this sort of surprising evolution in my identity and how I feel about that. And to do that, I tell the story both of my own childhood and the wider story of German-Jewish relations since 1945, essentially. And I say a little bit about a couple of experiences I've had with sort of straight-out anti-Semitism or right-wing extremism, but those were very rare, and they were not a particularly important part of sort of how my identity has changed. For me personally, it wasn't primarily violence or hatred that made me feel that I would never be German. It was benevolence. Far from being openly anti-Semitic, most Germans I met were so keen to prove to me that they weren't anti-Semitic that they treated me with a kind of nervous niceness usually reserved for the mentally handicapped or the terminally ill. Driven by misplaced guilt and embarrassment about the things their ancestors had done to mine, they ended up feeling limitlessly sorry for me. The effect of the pity and the virtue was to leave both of us with a sense that I couldn't possibly have anything in common with them. This was made worse by the understandable but deeply alienating fear of making a misstep. It's a fear that makes the simplest interaction between Jew and Gentile quickly degenerate into a politically correct comedy of errors. A friend assuming that I must speak Hebrew at home goes into panegyrics about how beautiful a language it is. Another friend conspiratorially informs me that her family people are 1/7 Jewish. And an acquaintance with genuine empathy tactfully inquires whether I find the word Jew offensive. At times, this compulsive niceness manifests itself in the least likely situations. As I realized when, at age 17, I found myself in the waiting room of a recruitment center for the Bundeswehr, the German army, the fear of offending a Jew now even suffices to terrify them. I had been summoned for my Musterung, a compulsory army physical which, for those unfortunate enough to pass muster, was followed by a year's military service. I'd only been waiting for 5 minutes when a fresh-faced soldier in uniform, not more than a few years older than me, marched up to my chair and stiffly extended his hand. "How do you feel about committing to a career in the Bundeswehr, Yasha?" The young soldier, Thomas, he informed me with imperious friendliness, was good at his job. Before I had a chance to answer, he launched into an account of the advantages of patriotic service. "You get 12 years of guaranteed employment," Thomas gushed, "but that isn't all. The army will train you. Wouldn't you love to learn how to fly a bomber?" I pointed out that I would not. Actually, I said, playing my trump card with a thumping heart, I would like to apply for an exemption of indeterminate length from compulsory military service. But why? Article 12a of the Constitution specifies that individuals can be exempted if military service would induce special hardship, are recited. According to a directive issued by the Defense Ministry, such special hardship obtains if a person's direct ancestors were persecuted by the Third Reich on grounds of ethnicity. This applies to me, I'm Jewish. Thomas couldn't have turned whiter even if he'd known my family's history in its tragic details. Oh, of course, I'm so sorry. I'm just here to recruit people. You'll have to speak to an administrator. Please, why don't you just sit down and I'll go get somebody to talk to you as soon as they possibly can. Within minutes, Thomas was back. Lost for words, he suddenly led me to the table of a middle-aged woman, a civilian who looked as though she would have been uncomfortable even under less vexing circumstances. I've heard about your problem. Having pronounced all but the last consonant, she decided that the word was vastly inappropriate. I mean, about your situation. Could you just explain your request again? I did in greater detail than before, but after listening in silence, my interlocutor told me that she only worked part-time. Really, unfortunately, seriously, she did not know what to do. I was sent to someone yet more senior. Herr Weiland, another civilian, seemed to feel a little more comfortable in his own skin. As I entered his second-floor office, which was adorned with a poster of Mallorca, a plastic palm tree, and a Bundeswehr calendar featuring soldiers smilingly displaying the latest weaponry, he vigorously shook my hand. Then, sitting me down near his desk, from where I enjoyed a full view of his computer screen, he calmly went about searching his hard drive for a template order that might apply to my case. Special hardship because the potential recruit's labor is indispensable on the family farm. No. Special hardship because 2 elder brothers have already served. No. Special hardship because a relative has died in the service of the army. Not quite. Apologetically, he turned to me. I'd love to give you the official document now, but I'll have to come up with the right formulation. You could wait around, or else I promise I'll have it sent to you by Christmas. Now Herr Weiland too turned white. I mean, by panicked, he gave up a heroic attempt to remember not only the name, but even the pronunciation of Hanukkah. By the 24th of December, definitely, I promise. Those words, uttered less than 30 minutes after I'd arrived for my Musterung, ended my adventures with the German army. The usually methodical bureaucrats even forgot to make me take the army physical, in theory a legal requirement, special hardship or no special hardship. On the 24th of December of that year, the state's Christmas present duly arrived in the form of a letter officially informing me that, due to his very special family circumstances, the potential recruit shall be granted an exemption from compulsory military service. Sometimes Germany's anti-Semitism has its advantages. I wouldn't have liked to waste a year performing the task that made up Germany's military service, even if I weren't Jewish, nor would it have been particularly fun to strip naked in front of a military commission so that the Bundeswehr could assess the potential usefulness of my physical constitution for war. Even so, in my experience, all of these forms of special treatment ultimately add up to an overall feeling of alienation. The very mention of a simple fact about me, a fact I'm not prepared to hide away in shame, however little importance it might have to me in my daily life, now suffices to make me a strange and exotic creature. I fear that so long as this remains the case, I will always feel estranged from my nominal compatriots. Now, when I was growing up, the feeling that as a Jew I could never truly be German was further compounded by something else, a spreading sense of resentment against the country's supposed obsession with the past, a resentment that's voiced especially loudly by younger Germans. One beautiful Saturday morning in the fall of 2006 at 11 a.m., I went to Munich's Oktoberfest with a large group of friends and acquaintances. We had arrived this early to beat the crowds to one of the coveted tables inside the massive tents. Our first beer, the only acceptable drink, no matter the time of day, had just been served. As is customary, the mugs in front of us contained eine Maß, or just under 2 pints of freshly brewed Bavarian lager. How do you fit 200 Jews into a small car? Stephanie, a petite woman in her late 30s, asked me as she peeped over the rim of a giant beer mug. Stephanie, one of her friends, chided her, more teasing than angry. We haven't even had a sip yet. I propose a toast to, as von Command, the Umperband, a jolly brass combo in lederhosen, started playing. It proposed in song a traditional Bavarian toast, ein Prosit auf die Gemütlichkeit, a toast to conviviality. We gathered up our mugs, clinked, put the mugs down again in a not local tradition, lifted them up a second time, and finally imbibed. A contented sigh escaped my lips. Now that you've all had a sip, go ahead and take a guess, Stephanie asked. How do you fit 200 Jews into a Volkswagen Beetle? Knock it off, will you? This is not appropriate, Hans, a big-boned, folksy friend of mine, said. Why should I? Stephanie shot back, her earlier guise of provocative playfulness giving way to anger. Because you tell me to shut up? Because they tell me to shut up? Come on, it's just a joke. I doubt it'll be funny, Hans said. Not funny? Have a sense of humor. Why can't a joke about the Jews be funny? It's 2006. The Holocaust happened 60 years ago. We should tell jokes about the Jews again. Look, Hans said, you know as well as I do that Germans have a special responsibility to be a special responsibility? I'm not even 40. No. I won't stay silent any longer. Here's how you fit them in. You gas them, you incinerate them, you stuff them in the ashtray. That's how you do it. Stephanie's joke was anti-Semitic. But even as her bad taste and provocative demeanor repelled me, I realized that her reasons for telling it were not anti-Semitic, at least not in a straightforward sense. Stephanie does not hate Jews as such, rather she hates standard conceptions of what Jews and her country's past should mean to her. In this sense, Stephanie is not just another neo-Nazi, she's part of a spreading movement. Unnoticed by much of the outside world, Germany's attitudes about its past and about the role that past should play in the present has begun to change. Since the 1990s, a mood of enough is enough has taken hold of the country. Advocates of a so-called Schlussstrich want to draw a finish line underneath Germany's preoccupation with World War II. After 60-odd years, they argue, it's time to make remembrance of the crimes committed by the Third Reich a less prominent part of public life. I have real sympathy for young Germans who want to move beyond the sometimes hysterical philosemitism of their elders. In particular, their avowed desire to treat Jews the same as anybody else is commendable. For all its good intentions, however, I fear that the finish line movement now runs the danger of being counterproductive. I'd love nothing more than to be treated as just another German, but many people my age are so determined to demonstrate that they won't treat me any differently just because I'm a Jew that, all too often, they end up treating me very differently indeed. How are we doing on time? I should wrap up. Do I have a minute or shall I? You can do a couple of minutes. Okay. So I think that these three different phases that Germany had of dealing with the past, at first sort of trying to say very much about it in a real taboo, and then the sort of rediscovery of the past, which led to the kind of philosemitism I described, and all these sort of awkward encounters, and now the attempt to move away from that, are still sort of lingering in various ways in Germany, and they all sort of coexist in a certain kind of way. For me, personally, as I outline, I decided that living in Germany, when you mention you're a Jew, it makes things sort of complicated often on an interpersonal level, not because people mean badly, just because it becomes awkward. And I found it very liberating to come to New York and feel that that wasn't the case anymore. And ironically for me, in New York, a city of 1.5 million Jews, the fact that I'm Jewish no longer really matters. I'm not religious. I'm not sure that I'm a cultural Jew. That's a complicated discussion, but I'm not sure what that exactly means. And so in New York, when living in Germany made me more and more Jewish in a certain kind of way, living in New York has allowed me no longer to identify as a Jew. And instead, I've come to identify as something else. And that's what I'd quickly like to close on. So as E.B. White remarked in his luminous essay on that most luminous of cities, New York is defined by its newcomers much more than by its natives. There are, White wrote, roughly 3 New Yorks. The first is the city of those who were born there. But a native New Yorker takes the city for granted and accepts its size and turbulence as natural and inevitable. The second is the city of commuters. White's disdain for them is palpable. Except in rare cases, the man who lives in Marmarek or Little Neck or Teaneck and works in New York discovers nothing more about the city except the time of arrival and departure of trains and buses and the path to a quick lunch. Finally, there's the third New York. The New York of those who were born elsewhere and came to the city in quest of something. Of these 3 trembling cities, White writes, the greatest is the last, the city of final destination, the city that is a goal. It is this third city that accounts for New York's high-strung disposition, its poetical deportment, its dedication to the arts, and its incomparable achievements. Commuters give a city its tidal restlessness, natives give it solidity and continuity, but the settlers give it passion. And whether it is a farmer arriving from Italy to set up a small grocery store in a slum, or a young girl arriving from a small town in Mississippi to escape the indignity of being observed by her neighbors, or a boy arriving from a corn belt with a manuscript in his suitcase and a pain in his heart, it makes no difference. Each embraces New York with the intense excitement of first love. Each absorbs New York with the fresh eyes of an adventurer. Each generates heat and light to dwarf the consolidated Addison Company. A true Berliner is one whose ancestors are German. A true Parisian is one whose parents, or better still, whose grandparents, were born inside the Boulevard Périphérique. A true New Yorker is one who has come to the city in quest of something. Whether he's a farmer arriving from Italy, a young girl arriving from a small town in Mississippi, a bower arriving from a corn belt, or a German Jew who no longer wants to be either a German or a Jew, he embraces New York with the intense excitement of first love, and without a thought for who he may be, is embraced by it in turn. It's because of its wonderful quality that New York has become my final destination. Here I can talk all I want about who I am or where I come from. It makes little difference. My identity is no longer that of a Jew or a German. It is that of a seeker who has found, that of a stranger who has come to be at home, that of simply and immeasurably a New Yorker.
So the last reader, and now we'll go from New York back across the sea to Germany. Atina Grossmann is professor of history at Cooper Union in New York City. Her books include Reforming Sex, the German Movement for Birth Control and Abortion Reform, 1920 to 1950, and as co-editor, volumes on crimes of war, guilt and denial in the 20th century and after the Nazi racial state, difference and democracy in Germany and Europe. Her many articles discuss gender and modernity in interwar Germany, history and memory in postwar Germany, and gender and human rights. Atina Grossmann's latest book, Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany, published in 2009, was awarded the George L. Moss Prize of the American Historical Association and the Frankel Prize in Contemporary History from the Wiener Library in London. Her current research focuses on transnational Jewish refugee stories, Soviet Central Asia, Iran, and India as sites of relief and refuge for European Jews during World War II. Please welcome Atina Grossmann.
Oh, it's on. It's on. Okay. Thank you. We really are running out of time, so we have to talk very fast. And I originally was invited, I think, to comment on both of these really fascinating and, on one level, extremely different books. I mean, one written as sort of a statement of farewell to Germany, and the other one written by someone who I think is very rooted in many ways in Germany, and yet it strikes me that both of your books in some way are about going from leaving a Germany behind. In your case, it's leaving the East for the West. In your case, it's leaving Germany and coming to New York. And yet I have the sense that for both of you, you're also dealing with questions, interestingly enough, of the absence or the struggle with the absence of or the struggle with Jewish identity that was not particularly central in your growing up, but yet it still always plays a role, and it's sort of interesting that we're going to maybe talk some about that today. The other thing that was so striking to me, particularly when I read Yasha's book, was the resonance of the titles, and that's why I come to my reading, where we have a book here that's called, here we go, Stranger in My Own Country, and in the late 1970s in Germany, there was sort of a spate of books written by German Jews, Jews living in Germany, with precisely that title. Leah Fleischman famously in 1980, This Is Not My Country, a Jewish woman leaves the Bundesrepublik, Dies ist nicht mein Land. Henrik Broda and Michel Lang, who edited a book in 1981, Fremd im eigenen Land, Strangers in Our Own Country, Jews in the Bundesrepublik, 1981. And here it is, 2014, and along comes Yasha Monk and presents a book called Stranger in My Own Country, which led me back to a text that I published in 1981. Megan asked me to read from this very quickly. In May 1981, precisely in response to this very polemical text that Henrik Broder had published in Die Zeit. And I'm just going to read a tiny little aspect of this and really ask what has changed, because it seems to me, from my perspective, that an enormous amount has changed. And yet when I listen to Yasha, I wonder where these three perspectives actually meet. So this is 1981 in response to Broda. Dear Henrik, what you write in Die Zeit and Der Spiegel fascinates, angers, and concerns me. Despite our differences, it speaks to me. The child of parents who had managed to escape Berlin and emigrate to the United States after many adventurous detours, and the loss of families whom I know only from old photographs and deportation lists supplied by the International Red Cross, I, quote, returned to Germany for a few years to search for the traces of old stories, nostalgias, and nightmares. I could not let go of Germany because my parents could not let go of Germany. At home on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, all my parents' friends were emigres. German was spoken. The Aufbau came punctually every week. The pediatrician, dentist, shoe salesman, butcher were all German Jews. An entire neighborhood in Washington Heights we ironically called das Vierte Reich. For years, the rabbis read his sermons in German. My father was a restitution lawyer. Refugees were his business and his life. His Stammtisch was in the Café Eclair on West 72nd Street, where the Gugelhupf was particularly good. Nevertheless, I was the American child, not, as you describe yourself, the, quote, Jewish child in the land of the tormentors. When I entered kindergarten, speaking German, actually, and very little English, the ethnically and racially mixed New York City school system matter-of-factly placed me in the non-English speaking class, where I played at learning, and here we make the connection to Maxim, where I played at learning Puerto Rican Spanish. Some things haven't changed. My parents' determination to hang, and I did learn Puerto Rican Spanish. My parents' determination to hang on to their language and traditions was not so different from that of generations of other immigrants, though my mother and father, like many other German Jewish refugees, were perhaps a bit more arrogant towards their new home. For Berliners of the 1920s, the rest of the Western world appeared hopelessly Philistine. Not one of my playmates or friends was a real American. At least their grandparents, if not their parents, had been born elsewhere. All could speak a little Yiddish, Spanish, Italian, German, and yet we understood precisely that phenomenon as American. We took it for granted. This is 1957, mind you, in kindergarten on the Upper West Side. We took it for granted that one could be a hyphenated American, Black, Italian, Irish, Hispanic, Jewish. We lived in a world marked indeed by racism, but lacking Volksgemeinschaft. And it is the continued existence of this Volksgemeinschaft, healthy and relatively unquestioned, that was the biggest shock of my 3-year stay in Germany. You must have experienced this fact every day, Henrik. I had to travel to Berlin, the former metropolis of Weimar German Jewish culture, to discover what an incredible luxury it had been to grow up and live as a Jew in New York City. For the first time, I had learned to value the normality that you yearn for and seek in Israel, my straight, non-exotic position as a Jewish woman, which had not, however, developed in an embattled Jewish state, but in a very particular part of the diaspora. And I'll just stop with that for a moment, but I mean, what's interesting is that in a sense, you come to New York to escape being Jewish. At the time, Henrik thought he could go to Israel to escape being Jewish. At the time, we were quite convinced that we would soon hear from Henrik with a book saying, "Auch dies ist nicht mein Land." This, too, is also not my country, which indeed, I think, happened. And I suspect that something similar may happen with you at some point, that we discover that maybe New York isn't quite what one imagines. But the question that I would have, and I want to know,
If you want to go ahead. I thought you were still reading.
The question that arises for me is whether this image of the Volksgemeinschaft that was so difficult for me to cope with when I was in Germany in the late 70s and 80s, at the beginning of the memory boom, just as Holocaust was about to be screened, right? And I think in a way, now that the memory boom is in a sense fading, whether that Volksgemeinschaft really still exists in the way that you were describing, or in the way that even you, I think maybe with your sort of comfort with living in Berlin now might address, or whether in fact we really are dealing with a quite different Germany than the one that Broda and Fleischmann wanted to leave, or that I wanted to leave. A Germany that really is much more multicultural, much more complicated, much more marked by fragmented identities, and also where the concerns of Jews in Germany, I think, have shifted a great deal. If we look at the program of Tabut or Limud, the questions are not about philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism. They are about what does it mean to be a Jew in the diaspora. They're not so different from the questions that we're asking here. They're about transnational identity. They're about what does it mean to be a Jew within German society, within European society, within a world marked by conflict. So I'm actually very curious about that question. I'm also curious about.
Well, why don't we just take that question? Why don't maybe Maxim would want to talk about that a little bit, about what Germany, since you are the representative of someone who lives there now. I wonder if you could talk about what, if you feel that it is. If these descriptions seem like something that you recognize, or if it's a more multicultural situation, or...
I have no idea what Volksgemeinschaft does mean today. I think if you ask to a young German, or even to a middle-aged German like myself, there's no meaning in it. Volksgemeinschaft, I don't know. I think that in Germany we have now so much identities, so much different approaches, so much other problems. I asked last year. I wrote an article about the unification. What was the feeling of young people? And I asked to 18 years old people what was the feeling, and I asked about East and West, and they just asked me, what's East and West? It's between rich and poor. We have to. It's so even this category, East and West, it's never been. It's not so important. So I think Volksgemeinschaft, for me, it's a very historical term. So I don't know what's the connection between this term and the.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's true that nobody sort of speaks of we are Volksgemeinschaft today, right? So as an actively claimed term, I don't think it exists except on very far right fringes. But I think if you ask people in all of Germany, including Berlin, but especially outside of Berlin, is this guy who was born in Germany, whose name is Turkish and whose parents came from Turkey, a real German? That is a question, those terms, that is a question that a lot of people would think is a natural question. And a lot of people would say, no, he's a Turk, right? And so I think that there is a battle on those kinds of things about whether or not there is a real German. And that concept is exclusionary. And there's a lot of parts of a country, the metropolis, and perhaps a lot of the time more international, more educated milieu, and so on, where everybody would say, yes, of course, you can have Germans who are black or Asian or come from, or Turkish, children of Turkish immigrants. But there's also a lot of parts of the country where say, no, real Germany is, being overrun or whatever. And these people are not real Germans. So in that sense, I think there is an operative concept of a Volksgemeinschaft. And I think the battle for the future of Germany is a battle about whether that category of a real German will eventually disappear. And I'm not entirely pessimistic. I think there's a good chance that it might disappear, but there's also a chance that it won't disappear. And that, by the way, is not just a German question, it's the European question of our age. Right? It's a similar question in France and Holland and so on.
You're right, but it's a question of concept of national identity. I think it's a tradition in the blood right in Germany. You are German if you have German blood, and it's it's still to be a national concept, and it's a difference between a French concept and a German concept. I just don't think that there's if you had asked 10 years before in Berlin if someone living in Kreuzberg or born in the second generation from a Turkish family, but born with Turkish papers, because that's the problem in Germany. You don't have this naturalization automatically if you're born there. The answer was automatically the answer that you said, but I'm not sure if it's still like this today. My impression is that people are changing in Berlin. I don't know how it is in other regions of Germany, but you are right that the concept of identity it's completely different between New York and Germany, or the States and Germany. When I see around here in New York, I'm very impressed by this multicultural life and normal life. It's so normal that nobody knows what's going on here. And I realized that in Berlin we are living in ghettos, in the Turkish ghetto and the huge German ghetto, and there's not so much possibility to mix up.
Well, I mean, now it's almost 7, so I think it makes the most sense to take a question or two from the audience at this point. The question is whether people are described as in compound terms like Deutsch Turkish or Afrikanisch, Deutsch Afrikanisch, or that's right. That's
Well, the new politically correct term, of course, is, mit Migrantenhintergrund, Germans of migration background. So people, I think, are struggling to find terms.
I'm German and I've been living here for 13 years, and I'm just wondering what your observations are of the new generation of Germans who don't, who didn't get a chance to, where there's no direction anymore to those involved in the war, no direct connection, the one we still had with our grandparents. Do you feel like there is still a question of guilt that's perceived among them, or do you think that's changed completely? And that generation, I mean, how does that generation think about the war? I mean, I know it's still a huge subject in schools. I'm just wondering on a personal, emotional level what your perspective is of that generation today.
I would say that there's not a feeling of guilt, but they are concerned. They feel concerning, but not concerned, but concerning about of the German history and the Third Reich, and it is a main subject in school. They know many things about it, more perhaps today than 30 years ago. But I think they are. My impression, I don't know. I'm not so in connection with 18 years old people, but my impression is that they are much more free to feel and to express themselves, and they are not so they're not so feeling involved or in this German tradition, and they sometimes I have the impression that they look like outsiders, like foreigners about German history, and as if their own grandparents looks like strangers in their family, and it's so historical now that it's unreal for most of them. I think, my impression.
Would you like to comment on that also?
I mean, I teach Jewish and German history at Humboldt every now and then, and so they're not 18, they're 20-year-olds, and I mean, my sense is that it's extraordinarily hard to generalize, that Berlin is not Germany, but that this is, at least to the degree that one is talking about students, that yes, that this third generation or even fourth generation is able to ask questions, to be interested, to, in many ways, ask the questions that their parents were not able to ask or didn't want to, even as they sort of, collectively dealt with the history of the Holocaust and Nazism, but that on an individual level and really confronting family history, that was not something that the second generation was willing or able to do. Whereas the third generation in some sense is, and it is because I think they feel themselves more as Europeans than as Germans, because they're used to sitting in classrooms with Erasmus students, with exchange students, because they all have taken in some way advantage of having those EU passports, because they, I think, maybe don't even understand but enact that it is an extremely different Germany than the one, for example, that I experienced still, in 1980, or that was the one that the second generation of Jews in Germany felt they had to really confront or deal with. So I tend to be much more sort of. I'm in a very optimistic mood today about youth. Maybe ask me at the end of the semester, and I'll feel differently.
I'll give this to you, though, because maybe you can ask one more question.
Thank you.